Hi! Welcome back to another YouTube session of the One Take Wonder episode titled above. Please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps so much in the algorithm, and thank you so much for tuning in for this little behind the scenes. I hope you're having a good night or day wherever you're watching, and just know that I'm extremely appreciative of you being here. Thanks. Okay. Welcome back to another episode of the BIA nominated podcast, One Take Wonder. That's right, if you're listening to this now, you still have time to go and nominate me for Best Podcast of 2025. Thank you so much to the BIA Awards. It's the Black Influence and Achievement Awards. Okay, for a second I thought I said awards. But it means so much for me to be here. It means so much to have, just be considerate. And again, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you. And also, while you're listening to this, you can definitely tune in and vote. If you're listening or watching this on YouTube, the link is in the description box. The link is also in the description box of this episode. Yeah, by the time you're done with this episode, you could have already been voted. Only takes a few minutes. So I wanted to give an update on what this episode is about. Last week I said that I wanted to talk about the correlation between pandemics and fascism, and that research is just taking longer than anticipated. I think I mentioned last week that my sister, who I'm so incredibly proud of, she's like the coolest person I know, officially got into her surgical residency program, and so we've been celebrating all week. Everybody say congratulations, T. She is the smartest person I know. I'm so lucky to be her sister, and that has eaten up a lot of the time that I would otherwise spend researching. Also, it's a very vast topic. I didn't realize when I said it the depth of research that I would personally want for myself. I feel like the other thing is the ADHD broadcast is one of the episodes that I'm the most proud of. It was also incredibly time intensive just to perform that research, to go through the articles. I have a couple of standards that I want to set for myself. The first is that if I have a book, make sure I'm reading passages of the book, which I've bought a couple books and I have a couple books that I picked up from the library. But then if I'm going to be reading an online article, I want to make sure that you guys don't have to go through a paywall. So whether that's because I pay for the Atlantic, so I'm able to gift articles, but also I don't want the information to be behind a paywall, so that kind of limits where I can come from. And I also just want to get my bearings. It's kind of like writing a paper when you were back in school, where you're just going through each source, getting your information, and then not going through a script. But what I did for the ADHD broadcast was I just had all the articles in front of me and sort of a general flow of like where I wanted to go and how I wanted to address this. So I am working on that episode. I recorded a couple of segments, but it's not done yet. And I don't want to put out something that's incredibly rushed and not to the standard that I want it to be, particularly for such a research-intensive topic. Speaking of topics, April Fool's Day is coming up. I'm recording this on March 23rd, and April Fool's Day, so it's next Tuesday. I would love to do an April Fool's Day episode very reminiscent of the one that I did last year. I won't do a Gollum impression again. I will be doing a voice, and you can send in advice on everything except for your situationship. I cannot put into words how much I am not going to tolerate you doing that. Don't even think about it, girl or boy or they. Gender is not an important consideration when I say this. Like, please don't ever think that I have the patience for that. I cannot emphasize this enough. I'm not a patient person. I've been trying to work on it for almost 28 years. I would love to say that I'm better than I was last year. No. But other than that, I would love to do an advice episode. I don't know. I think it would be like a little One Take Wonder tradition to keep doing like the little advice on April Fool's Day. There's something so whimsical and funny about it. And also, I love pranks. I think I talked about this last year, but like I really love pranks. And I love watching prank videos on the internet. Not ones where it's like couples in the car and they're clearly like faking it, but when people are like they jump out at someone. I did that to my mom once. That was a mistake. She's from Detroit, not a great neighborhood in Detroit. That's when I realized that she knows how to punch. Do not jump out on your parents who grew up in the hood. That was a... Yeah, but other than that, I do love pranks. And I don't know, I love whimsy. So I'm in a really good mood because I'm really excited for my sister. I also finished Sunrise on the Reaping. Okay. If you do not want to hear spoilers for the newest Hunger Games book, Sunrise on the Reaping, I will put in the comments, or not in the comments, like in the description box, when you can, when you can jump ahead to, so that I'm no longer talking about it, because I don't want to spoil it for you, and I understand the book hasn't even been out for like a week. At the same time, I am dying to talk about it. I do need to reread it again, just because my first time reading something, like I was a English major, I very rarely annotate as I read the first time, which is not like a great habit. I just like read it full through and then I go back, and then that's when I really dive into the material. And I was just reading it, you know, to read it and to find out what happened during, actually, you know what, you don't need to skip ahead, because I'm not actually going to talk about it. I need to read it again. Okay, no, I will. Here are my preliminary, I really hope they skipped ahead. Can you imagine not skipping ahead and then I totally spoil it? Here's some things that had me sobbing at 1:30, 1:45 in the morning, early Saturday morning when I finished it. The body horror of Luella and Lulu. So District 11 is black, right? Suzanne Collins went out of her way, because the controversy with like Rue, and people really couldn't identify with Rue being a little black girl, to say that Rue and Thresh were African American. Again, Panem is based on a fallen America that is subject to ecological disaster. It's a dystopian novel, right? And District 11 are African Americans, and we see that this is even a feature, 10 years after the war, in the Ballad of Songbirds and Steak during Lucy Gray's Games, which again were the 10th Hunger Games, to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Dark Days being over, at least over for the capital. And it's still an African American district. And then we have this character, Lulu, who is the body replacement for Luella, who is a little seam girl with gray eyes and white skin. Although Suzanne Collins doesn't explicitly say that her skin is white, the rest of her like descriptors and the fact that she is a typical seam kid, which, like the gray eyes, the more tan skin, she's white, right? There's a lot of debate amongst the Hunger Games fandom whether or not like Katniss and some of the other seam residents are meant to be indigenous. I don't really, it's based on Appalachia, which like, yes and no. There's certainly mixed race people in Appalachia. I'm from Appalachia, fun fact. Pittsburgh is the Paris of Appalachia, even though nobody calls it that. There are black people in Appalachia. This is quite literally what my senior thesis was on, like Afro-Latin, which is African-American Appalachian literature, but Afro-Latin literature. There certainly are black people, but Luella is not described to be as black. This was a very rambling way of saying that not only did they kidnap Lulu because she was the child of traitors, torture her beyond comprehension, erase most of her memories, but they also physically altered her appearance so that she looked like Luella. We see that description where she has the same childhood scars that Luella has, and she has the same bitten down fingernails, and Haymitch notices that she slightly increased, like puffed up her cheeks, so that she has the fullness that Luella had to her face, fullness in comparison to Lulu, who has, been starving and suffering and such. And it's like, yeah, they absolutely could have changed her skin color. And I think there's a very interesting implication of like race in the Hunger Games that I don't know if Suzanne Collins meant to touch on or not, just considering that this novel was published in the early 2000s when there wasn't as much of a push. I mean, honestly, in literature, even now, but like you could definitely get away with only doing like one or two mentions of races in the Hunger Games. Like the movies is a bit different, especially the newer movies like Ballads of Songbirds and Steak. They tried to make it more diverse, but in the books, like there's almost no mention of, like Asian people. And Latinos is just like kind of inferred. Like it's really mostly white and then some black. But I do wonder if, like at the same time, race is obviously a consideration when you consider that District 11 is described as having the most intense police keeper presence, which goes back to, you know, police brutality that's often enacted against Black people in America. And then the fact that they're the district responsible for harvesting like all of the food, and they're working on conditions in the American South that's very reminiscent of slavery, and that was an intentional point on Suzanne Collins' part. And also the fact that there are no other Black people in any other districts. This is something that I've thought about endlessly really since reading The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So Lucy Gray is, you know, she was Covey, and the Covey traveled along the districts until, you know, the war, or sometime during the war, when the peacekeepers confined them to District 12, which was like their last stop before this rule got enacted. And so it makes me wonder if Panem, the government, made a concerted effort to sort of segregate people by race. That's always what I assumed. I've never thought that it was a coincidence that all Black people ended up in District 11. Even if you understand that, like, based on the map of Panem, you know, like District 12 is Appalachia, District 11 is a huge district in the sense that, like, also America has shrunk, and Panem, which is, you know, like, grew out of the fallen United States, is very much like a shrunken and distorted United States, right? Like, some of the areas are flooded due to ecological disaster, California's in the water, Florida's in the water, right? All of that stuff. But District 11 is the American South, and the majority of Black people in the United States still live in the South, particularly when you look at this by ethnicity, like African-American ethnicity in particular. The majority of us are still concentrated in the American South because slavery. I'm not saying there aren't a lot of Black people everywhere else, but, like, wow, when you consider the numbers of, like, being in the North versus being in the South, especially for our ethnic group, which we know Rue and Thresh are, yeah, it's there. And so I've always wondered if, like, how invested Snow is in, like, keeping that particular demographic down. Like, I think we can infer from, based on The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and then how we see Snow react to 12, that 12 has been artificially suppressed by Snow because of his hatred of Lucy Gray. Right, like, partially, yes, he killed, oh my goodness. Why did I just forget her name? Oh, Hamish's girlfriend. Lenore Dove. Yes, Lenore Dove was partially killed because, yes, she was Hamish's lover, and that's how the Capitol enacts its revenge, but also partially because Snow has personal beef with the Covey. It's just not a coincidence that certain districts always win. And this is, like, one of the oldest Hunger Games theories that, you know, they're... Wait, let me get my book. Hold on. And I'm actually just going to grab my book. We're back! Okay. So as I was flipping through the text to find my point, because I wanted to find that particular passage in Sunrise on the Reaping where they're talking, I think it's in preparation for the interviews, where they're talking about the fact that the Capitol becomes uncomfortable with the career districts, who notably is districts 1, 2, 4, and 5. And we know that by the time it's Katniss's games, it's only 1, 2, and 4. 5 is no longer a career district. So it's really interesting to find out when 5 fell off. Because that's a pretty, when you consider, like, 25 years to go from being an established career district to be a district that if I'm remembering correctly, and remember, this is just me going off the dome, I can fact check when I talk about Sunrise on the Reaping more in depth, but when it's Katniss's games, like, I don't believe that District 5 survives a very long time, and we actually don't know much about the district. If I'm remembering Lucky Lefty, shout out to her. You just have to give Lucky Lefty her praise. She single-handedly revamped the internet's fascination with the Hunger Games. I understand that, like, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes had, you know, kind of come out around that, like, a little bit before at that time, but it was her just deciding to dive into it that now all these bitches are her sons, and everyone is, like, a Hunger Games commentator, and she's just doing it at a level that, like, other people cannot compare. So back to what I was saying, that District 5 was, you know, a career district and now it's not. In the interviews with Caesar Flickerman, we see that districts 1 and 2 are coming across as stupid beasts. So just to quote from a passage, quote, "The rest of the tributes from districts 1 and 2 seem to realize they're in danger of being classified as stupid beasts too. So they make an effort to play up their prowess with weapons and the benefits of the career pact. But panache has done some damage, and any attempt to boast about muscle comes with a comedic side-eye from Caesar that tickles the audience. I remember my pa saying, if you can get people to laugh at someone, it makes them look weak. He means the heavies in the capital, but it seems to be true up here as well." Unquote. So this is very interesting from when it's Haymitch is watching the games, and I actually think it's important to read and find that passage. Again, I didn't annotate, so we're just kind of bouncing around on around as I'm trying to loosely remember where things are. But when it's Haymitch's games and he's sort of watching them on the screen, and again, this is a book that's all about propaganda, we see the careers come off as a lot more fleshed out, which sort of bolsters the theory that like the careers are being lifted up with the insistence of the capital. Remember that the actual like Caesar Flickerman interview with the careers are not coming off well. It's actually the newcomers who are being presented as, quote, "The capital's buzzing about the newcomers. While the audience is treated to highlights of fashion throughout the games, District 5 called an emergency meeting in the green room. As the sole remaining career district, this will be their alliance's last chance to present their case against the newcomers. The rest of the evening will belong to us." Unquote. Da, 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 da. Let's see. Oh, okay, here. Quote, "Nobody talks too much about themselves. They stress the power of the group and the advantages the newcomers will exploit in the arena. How small size can be a plus for climbing trees or hiding or needing less food. How being able to trust your teammates means you'll get better sleep, so the careers won't be catching any Z's. And how brain power, which we have in spade, comes in handy for everything from strategy to building things to catching food. In the brief moments when they pitch their personal skills, it's about how they'll use them to help one another. Maybe we'll lose, but we're sure making a lot of people proud back home." Unquote. And that seems to be the biggest problem for the capital when they actually decide to put together the propaganda of what Haymitch's games really are. Also, you can tell that they give themselves editing time. Katniss says that she watches the games and they come on at 10 a.m. Haymitch goes on at 9 a.m. So it seems like they're giving themselves an hour for editing. Granted, these are games that are 25 years apart, but I just wanted to read that quote before we jump to the end. Pause, but you won't hear that pause. This is just for me editing. Boop! Found it! Okay, perfect. So I found the passage. Just to contextualize, this is when Haymitch has already won the games. He's watching the games as is customary for the victors to recap the games with Caesar Flickerman, and they're expected to give commentary. So, quote, "The careers have been edited to appear smarter, the newcomers less unified. Does anyone even notice this besides me? Lulu's reduced to a girl wearing live reptile fashion. Maisie and Wyatt's memorable turns are entirely ignored, and I get one snarky exchange with Caesar. So, Haymitch, what do you think of the games having 100% more competitors than usual? I don't see that it makes much difference. They'll still be 100% as stupid as usual, so I figure my odds will be roughly the same. The audience laughs, and I give them this grin that confirms me as a stuck-up, selfish jerk. No mention of my support of the newcomers. No silly interplay about making booze for the peacekeepers. The rascal's just a jackass." Unquote. So it really goes to show that in the end, they wanted the careers who are careers, not... The careers are given the opportunity to become careers because they're producing the most lucrative or valuable materials for the capital, not in terms of what's actually useful, like coal or food, like districts 11 and 12, but useful in the fact that it makes the districts have an inflated sense of self and like they're closer to the capital, and that prevents unity, right? Like one of the smartest things the capital ever did was get the majority of their peacekeepers from yes, the capital, but also District 2 provides a lot of peacekeepers, and so that was why it was so contentious, and we really see this tension in Mockingjay because essentially the police are coming from the same station, like the same oppression, as the other districts, but they are also the oppressors. And so that's why District 2 was the last to turn and sort of join the rebellion against the capital, because they had a vested interest. They had a good thing going for them with the military academy. And because they are careers, they get better advantages. We see that career children are better fed, better nourished. Again, you just take this with a grain of salt. It's like when Haymitch and Katniss describe being from the seam versus like their resentment towards the merchant class. And that's why it's important to have like Peeta and Maisley's perspective. Talking about the fact that like, yes, Peeta grew up in a bakery, but his family could never actually afford to eat the bread. He was always eating stale bread. And so while he was in a materially better position than Katniss, in comparison to the wealth that's still being flaunted by the capital, he was nowhere near that. And he has actually experienced, you know, poverty, just not to the level that the seam children are, but merchant class is really a misnomer to describe what's simply a more genteel poverty, for lack of a better word. And so I wanted to find that this passage in the book to just, one, show the effect of the propaganda, which is an entirely different discussion, but also that the capital has a vested interest in building these resentments. And so I have to find that passage or it's not going to make sense. Wait, I'm sorry, I have to correct myself. District 5 is not a career district. They just teamed up with the careers in this instance. That's a huge correction. Again, I am just like going off the dome and flipping through the book while recording this. This is not like I need to read the book a second time to go through this, but essentially the capital is becoming uncomfortable with the position that the career districts feel that they have, because it makes the careers feel too close to the capital residents. And we know from the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes that the capital residents truly believe that district makes you animal. And so part of District 12's strategy is to not sort of endear themselves to the audience by pretending like, oh, I'm one of the audience, but to say, no, actually I'm completely alien and I'm here for your entertainment. By Haymitch taking the perspective that like he's a rascal, you know, Wyatt boasting his skills, Maisley, you know, again, she's giving a commentary on fashion, but she's giving a commentary in a way that's like, she is not one of y'all, whereas the careers very much want to come across as trying to be capital-like. And we also see these fears probably manifested because the war was only 50 years prior. You still have generations of people like the Plinths who were able to cross over from District 2 successfully into the capital. And while we see that they were never fully integrated into the capital, families like the Plinths, like at this point, their children are having children who are completely capital born, and so you don't want more people who feel like they can come over and cross the threshold into your very segregated society that doesn't allow for class, or in this case, district mobility. This was a very roundabout way of trying to get to the point about District 11. Because, yeah, it seems like a very intentional choice to keep everyone segregated by race, just for the same reasons that it's advantageous to a certain government now, because it builds and breeds resentment. It's hard to build unity with people who you perceive to be so different from you, and physical difference is just the easiest difference to exploit. We had to do a lot of book flipping to make that point, but I don't know, it's taking me back to my college days, so I appreciated it. What are some other, mostly it was just the Luella thing that I wanted to talk about for now with Sunrise on the Reaping. I loved the propaganda element. I love this book so much. It was so disturbing, but so good, and I loved the lore and the implications that we got for Panem. I loved, I don't know, it was so good. I feel like I'm getting so close to that passage. No, I think I'm so close. I know it was right around here. Mm-hmm. I can't find it. We're just gonna have to move on. So I definitely want to come back and do a longer episode on Sunrise on the Reaping when I've had a chance to actually go through, annotate the book, and really make my full thoughts about it. I just can't stop thinking about like the racial body horror implications of Luella. The fact that like District 11, much like District 12, has the children are all our own, paraphrasing James Baldwin there, mentality, wherein like because the children of District 11 are put to work so young, they're sort of collaboratively raised by all of the adults around them. Much in the same way that while District 12 doesn't have the resources to provide or care for the children around them, there is a sense of like community, and at least if the only thing you can do is to bear witness to like who these children are and pay attention to them. It's not a coincidence that all of the District 12 members, whether they have the means to provide for other people or not, are aware of the children around them, much in the same way that like District 11, their contestants look out for each other. And we actually see the strongest camaraderie, if you ignore like Katniss and Peeta, between the District 11 contestants in Katniss's games. While Rue and Thresh never paired up, like Thresh obviously had a strong affinity for Rue, he looked out for her, and then when you go back to the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, Reaper and Dill, both District 11 contestants, like Reaper was invested in Dill's safety to the point where he could have won the Hunger Games. He had the brawn, he had the strength, and that was obviously like a rebellious choice, and we see that rebellion in District 11 time and time again by not allowing the games to strip them of their humanity or to sort of act out the games for their own ends, which I actually think there's some very interesting implications to what Haymitch Abernathy's father said to the other, the orphan who got selected as a tribute for District 12, and he said, you know, you go in there and you don't let them change you, don't give the Capitol what they want. How that sentiment was echoed by Peeta, but also how that sentiment is really echoed by so many contestants, and how that's their own private like sabotage should not be turned into a monster by these games. And it almost makes me wonder if part of what's keeping some of the districts back from winning, if you can even call winning the Hunger Games like truly winning, just given what happens to them afterwards, is this idea that you also have to make your district proud, but that what makes the district proud, I think, versus, you know, the careers just want you to win by any means necessary, and that means being as brutal as possible, and that's what they train you for. But the other districts, it's about not playing into the Capitol's hands, and that doesn't seem to be like a particular feature of like certain individuals. That seems to be a sentiment that is carried out over and over and over again throughout the districts. Like, is it a surprise that so many of the districts, the unlikely ones who have won, have done so without a lot of bloodshed or with cunning? Is that sort of an undiscussed happenstance between the districts that you can take our children and you can slaughter them, but we are sending our children out there with the understanding that they probably won't win, they probably won't come home, but they will maintain some dignity by not participating in the slaughter? And the reward for that pride is, of course, watching children from your districts be brutally massacred, often in horrible, violent ways, right? And this is something I've been thinking a lot, because Haymitch, I didn't pay attention to it until like having read Sunrise on the Reaping and going back and, you know, briefly skimming my copies of the Hunger Games, realizing how conscious they are of like how their district perceives them, not just as like, oh, I can't, you know, betray my district mate, but also like what would make them proud, and the real apprehension that Haymitch has in, you know, he is not being perceived or put out there by the Capitol as someone who cared about the newcomers, and that clearly is something that bothers him. Obviously, the Capitol had to destroy the newcomer solidarity in their edit of the Hunger Games because it's a detriment to what they're putting the Hunger Games out there for, right? Like, it's not a good thing that all the poorest districts, all the disadvantaged districts, all the districts who do not benefit from Capitol affiliation, band together, that they had to put their foot down, you know, from the Capitol's perspective. So to have Haymitch be the loner and the outsider, and to make it look like he's just an asshole, and the only surviving, or not surviving, but the only portion of his interview to be memorialized in the official recap, the official like film of the games, the only thing that Katniss and Peeta will ever observe, and the only thing that anybody ever remembers, because of the nature of the Capitol's strong propaganda, is that he was an asshole individualist, and not that he was part of a collaborative effort between all of the underdogs, aka the newcomers. That's deeply impactful. That is, oh wow, you know, saying that out loud, we're really working through that theory. It sets him up for alienation when he comes back, because you won, but you won like a career. I think there's also this thing of when you win in these disadvantaged districts, you win the wrong way and you're not really a winner at all. And also, that's just a feature of the Hunger Games, that with the exception of the career districts, like being a victor is meant to continuously alienate you. You know, notably, victors are not able to share their winnings with anybody but their families. So your best friends, so-and-so, like they cannot benefit from the fact that you now have these wealth and riches, and especially in a district like 12 where you have Katniss and Peeta and Haymitch living in a resplendent mansion in a village far away from their peers who are dropping dead of hunger and starving. That builds resentments in the same way that the, you know, slightly better standing of the merchant class versus the seam is meant to make sure that there can never be any unity, because you cannot become a merchant by virtue of anything other than birth, but you can certainly lose your merchant status and fall into the seam, or you can marry into the seam, which again was a very big deal for Burdock, Everdeen, and I forget Katniss's mother's name, but Katniss's mom to marry Burdock, Katniss's father, and essentially give up her merchant status and to never be able to go back to that and experience a, you know, extremely harsh poverty that almost killed her because she wasn't equipped for it after Burdock died. I understand Katniss's resentment towards her, but just from her point of view, like, she was not... Burdock was able to make a life for them and himself, and we also see that in Haymitch's rendition, like, the Everdeens were slightly better off than some of their scene counterparts, and so she wasn't marrying into, like, the most abject poverty. She was marrying into poverty, but Burdock always had a way to provide for them until he was blown up in the mines. Okay, maybe she didn't think that through, no offense to the Everdeen family. And being the victor's village completely alienates you, and also makes sure that even, you know, and then the unspoken thing of, like, you are taking these kids, and unless you are producing winner after winner after winner, like, it's like, oh, you have all these riches, and you get to go to sleep at night in your nice goose down bed, and you didn't get to save my kid. Yeah, there is... Every feature of coming home a winner from the games is meant to reduce that, but I truly think that Snow, just by virtue of spending time in District 12 and learning about the District 12, like, sentiments and loyalty, and just, not even 12 itself, but just being in the districts and seeing what the districts thought of the games, as someone who went on to take that experience, who someone went on to work with Dr. Gall and continue to perfect them, designing the victor rewards in such a way to foster continued resentment and to take advantage of the fact that obviously no district wants to be participating in the Hunger Games, even if the careers pretend that it's an honor, right? We see that not every child is trained for the careers. Like, it's kind of Annie is from a career district, but she was not a career herself as someone who really volunteered for the experience in the same way that many of her district mates did. Well, actually, that's kind of ambiguous and unclear. I have to go back and look that up. But where was I going with this? Oh, yes. That is also a good way to make sure that the victors are completely alienated. So I'd like to talk about that more in depth. I'd also like to touch on Severance. Let me just write down that this is 33 minutes into the podcast that I finally stopped rambling about the Hunger Games. One thing about Severance, I want to talk about the finale, but I don't want to talk about the finale of this episode. I want to talk about the penultimate episode, the interaction between Mr. Milchick and Miss Wong. And if you don't watch Severance, this part is going to be very confusing. I have to imagine that this may not be a very satisfactory episode if you don't want the Hunger Games spoiled for you, or if you didn't read the Hunger Games and you've just sort of been listening to this part and I never put any sort of plot overview or recap, and then now I'm talking about a show that you haven't seen. That's fine. I just need to get this off of my chest as something to come back to later. But that interaction between Mr. Milchick and Miss Wong actually sets up a lot about what's happening with Lumen and their child labor program. So Miss Cobell, who's the former manager of the Severed Floor and was terminated by Natalie and the board, has a scene, or has an entire episode where she goes back to her hometown, and we see that this was really a Lumen company town, and that child labor was pervasive and encouraged. You know, she talks about working in an ether factory and huffing ether, which is a very old-timey drug, and she hasn't done ether since she was 8. So she's working these vats, she's huffing ether, taking drugs to stay awake and become an alert and make sure that she's performing as an alert employee. And we learned that she went to something called the Myrtle Egan School for Girls. Now this was confirmed. This has been like Lumen theory for a while, but she went to the Myrtle Egan School for Girls. And she leaves her mother's home, she goes to the school, and then she's indoctrinated in Lumen for the rest of her life. Like, she gets a Lumen job. I think it's kind of implied that, like, all the Myrtle Egan, graduates just go on to work for Lumen in some way. And so we see a vantage, or a viewpoint of what, going through the Myrtle Egan School for Girls must be like through Miss Wong, Eustace Wong, actually, whose name means, like, steadfast, resilient. It's about determination, the name Eustace. And Eustace Wong has the Wintertide Fellowship, which is what Miss Cobell was originally rewarded, and that's where she came up with Severance. And now Miss Wong at the Wintertide Fellowship is working at Lumen. Her internship was a big deal. Cold Harbor, the file was going to be completed, and we see that she has resentment with Milchick. And in her dismissal scene, well, I guess we should talk about Miss Wong's employment. So Miss Wong is obviously a child. I think she's portrayed as like sometimes a middle schooler, or like, an early teen. She's definitely not 16, 17, maybe like anywhere between like 13 to 15. So she's this teen, and everyone around her has such a visible reaction because, she's a kid on the Severed Floor who's managing them like an adult. But the honorific, Miss sort of is supposed to elevate her beyond child status. They ask, like, why are you a child? And she's like, because of where I was born. And then within that same interaction, she quickly reminds people, like, I am your supervisor, I am your superior, I am above you, I am a person and you are not, because I am not severed, even if I'm a child, and technically in the real world I would never be able to talk to you like this. And you are simply an innie. And so in her final confrontation with Mr. Milchick, when he's informing her that she's been terminated, he's sending her to Svalbard, which, if you don't know anything about Svalbard, it's where, in order to go outside during certain parts of the year, you have to carry your rifle with you because polar bears live there. And if you don't know this about polar bears, they were the only wild animals that stalk and eat humans just for the fuck of it. A lot of predatory animals are like, yes, they'll eat humans, yes, they'll go after humans, but like polar bears will stalk their prey for miles and miles and miles. And so it's really a life or death situation. By the time you see a polar bear, it's seen you for hours, it's been following you, and it's been waiting until it perceives you as weak to attack. So that's where he's sending her. And he says, your bed will be moved from your parents' house, which I think is very Rickon-esque. You'll remember that Rickon has all of the his child with Devin, beds in the room, because he said that switching beds can be very traumatic, and he wants to avoid that trauma for her, which to me is a hint that Rickon is very much involved with Lumen. That's not my theory. The rest of this is my theory and my observations, but that's just something that, you pick up in the course of like perusing the Reddit. I'm not perusing the Reddit, I'm actually very deeply invested in the Reddit. And where's my miss? Oh, yes. So we have Miss Wong, whose bed is being shipped from her parents' house as to negate the trauma of having to switch out her beds. And of course, it won't be traumatic at all in Lumen's eyes to completely leave your parents and go to a separate corner of the world. And There's a lot of interesting questions, like, where was she staying when she was leaving her Lumen Wintertide Fellowship? I don't know, there's a lot going on. But he addresses her as Eustace Wong. He removes her position of power. And then to cement his power over her, he has her break her little toy, which is something that she's been playing with all season. If you watch the Apple TV promos, we see her constantly playing with toys, you know, really playing up the fact that, like, she is a child. This is her first work experience. She's very young. And she's literally a little girl. So he has her crush this. And then that same episode, when he's on the phone with Mark, Mark is like, you know, Mr. Milchick, it's just work. Sometimes I just don't feel like coming in. And Mr. Milchick is really emotionally affected by that, and he's staring at this iceberg poster, and I think it's meant to imply that, like, much like an iceberg, he has much more going on below the surface than he is permitted to show at Lumen. Lumen is very invested in policing Mr. Milchick's expression because he is a black man. And then also, and as much as Miss Huang is there to show, you know, probably what it was like for Cobell to go through the Wintertide Fellowship and whatever the Wintertide Fellowship looked like, you know, back when Lumen was in, when she was at Lumen, it's also meant to show that, like, Lumen has a very vested interest in getting diverse perspectives on, diverse personnel into their workforce now. At its core, Severance is also a satire of corporate America, and so we see in the way that Lumen gives Mr. Milchick these recanonicized paintings of Keir, where Keir is reimagined as a black man, but notably still has blue eyes, which is incredibly rare for a black person to have. It is meant to emphasize that, like, at your best as a black man, the best thing that you can do is to still emulate whiteness, and that's why it was truly so disturbing for Mr. Milchick. I think more than just Keir being recanonicized, like, as a black man with blue eyes is very jarring. I think there's a reason why they kept zooming in on the eyes during the scene. But also, I think that scene between It's Just Work is to really emphasize that, like, work is all Mr. Milchick has, probably because he was once a Miss Huang or a Miss Cobell. All of the higher ups in Lumen have some personal connection beyond just getting hired there, right? Like, it's not a coincidence that all the backstories of the higher ups at Lumen that we're permitted to see, Miss Cobell, Helena Egan, you know, Jane Egan, all of the Egans, really. The Egans are there because this is their family religion cult, although I don't believe that they were the original founders of Lumen, and I would send you to Real Enigmas and Theories on YouTube, because this is his original theory and his breakdown, and I love his content so much. I don't know if he's ever going to hear this, but dude, huge fan of you. But they have that connection, and then of course you have Miss Cobell, who's been indoctrinated into Lumen since she was a little girl, first as an employee, then finally getting to go to the Myrtle Egan School for Girls. You know, her aunt was a Lumen fanatic, and her mom didn't like Lumen, but her mom, who was sick and sort of physically powerless to stop Harmony from being really kidnapped into the system and brainwashed. And while we see other people who are able to break out of the Lumen thing, like when Lumen leaves Harmony Cobell's company town and just leaves the town decimated, there's some Lumen believers in there still, like Harmony's aunt, but then most of the people are just sort of broken, and it's very, you know, it's like mining towns where the company leaves and the mines have closed, and then the people just don't really have, like, any infrastructure or any like work, and they just become decimated, sort of getting off track. And then of course you have, like, Natalie and Mr. Drummond, who in one scene refer to Jane Egan, who's the current CEO of Lumen, as father, and we know, as confirmed in the finale, that Jane Egan has continued to sire progeny to see if he sees Keir in them. I think there's very good evidence that Jane Egan is essentially, or was trying to see Keir in so many people. Not a theory, he confirmed it. And so he's creating all of these bastards because he's incredibly unhappy with Helena. All of this, oh, right, and then Bert and Fields. Like, Bert and Fields were drawn into it by religious reasons, not Keir, but rather Christianity, that they went to a church that was very much, again, like, we see these themes where churches will embrace, like, dogma that is entirely, like, unchristian, or sort of endorsing political parties or economic theories more than as part of like church doctrine. And so we see them driven there by incredibly personal reasons, and it begs the question, like, what is Milchick's incredibly personal reason for being there? Because I have to imagine it's more about the job and more about the money. Like, he's always there. He has no life outside of Lumen. He's always on call. He's always performing his severed duties. He has very little pleasures in life outside of Lumen. And my theory is that actually it's because he's never had a life as part of Lumen. I think Milchick was part of the first wave of, you know, just given his age, just given the fact that he's supposed to be playing like a 30, 40-something-year-old man, as part of when Lumen realized to itself, like, oh, we would do better if we embrace diversity, not out of any sort of real, investment and wanting to advance, like, the standings of people of color or try to diversify their company, but for the same reasons that actual corporations do it, which is it was en vogue at the time. And so was he put in some sort of boy version of the Myrtle Egan School for Girls, some sort of Egan school where he was indoctrinated into Keir. That's my explanation for why he embraces them so heavily, because I have a hard time believing that with everything we know about Milchick's personality, he would continue to take this disrespect. And he doesn't tolerate the disrespect. Like, by the end of the season, we see him telling, Mr. Drummond to, like, eat shit. Devour feculence, Mr. Drummond. It means eat shit. Like, ooh. T. But, yeah, I have a hard time believing it, that he's doing it for something other than religious, personal, or brainwash reasons. And I think that's why it made him so sad when Mark said, work is just work. So that's just my little theory on Severance. I love Severance so much. I love diving into the theories, but I have to admit that, like, me as a Severance theorist may not be the strongest, other than the theory that I gave on TikTok that, like, Mr. Milchick is not a friend to the innies. He's just simply a kinder overseer than Miss Cobell, and I think he understands that the innies are people, and because he knows they're people, he knows that they have to be rewarded with sugar cubes and honey instead of with fear and whips, but that doesn't change the fact that they're still on a corporate plantation. And Mr. Milchick lacks the verve to sort of change their standing, although it'd be interesting to see if that happens in other seasons. So I'm excited for next week's episode. Again, if you're listening to this, please vote for me in the BIA Awards. It would mean so much. Please send in your advice, and don't forget that for the April Fool's episode, I would really love to talk, I don't know, giving you guys advice, and maybe also that little pause will help me wrap up the fascism research. As always, thank you so much for listening. This means so much to me to have you guys here with me. Mwah. Love you. Bye. And that's all, folks. See you next week. Bye.